You must understand something essential before we go any further. The mother wound is not merely a psychological scar you carry from childhood, nor is it simply the trace of a difficult relationship with the woman who brought you into this world. It is far more ancient, far more archetypal, far more deeply woven into the unconscious tapestry of the human soul than the personal stories you attach to it. When we speak of the mother wound, we are not speaking of a single individual. We are speaking of the broken thread that runs through entire generations, through entire cultures, through the collective psyche itself, and yet, even while it spans centuries of human experience, it expresses itself uniquely inside you, shaping your instincts, your fears, your sense of worthiness, the way you attach, the way you retreat, the way you long for connection, and simultaneously fear being seen. The mother wound is the first silence you ever learn to swallow. It is the first place where you internalize the belief that love must be earned, that softness must be controlled, that your true self must be hidden to ensure survival. And because a child will always choose survival over authenticity, you became what the environment required. You dulled your voice. You carried emotions that did not belong to you. You became vigilant to moods you never created. You learned to read the unsaid like scripture, especially in moments where gentleness should have been enough. The wound begins in that small, invisible moment when the mother, for reasons often beyond her own awareness, cannot mirror the child's inner being. She cannot hold the child's emotional truth, not because she is cruel, but because she herself was never held. She, too, was shaped by a mother who could not see her, by a lineage that taught silent endurance rather than conscious nurturing. And so, the mother wound is not an accusation. It is an inheritance. It is the unconscious passing of what was never healed, from one generation to the next, like a dream that keeps repeating because no one has yet awakened inside it. But you are the interruption of this dream. You are the point where consciousness begins to turn inward, where the psyche demands that the forgotten parts of you return home. That is why you feel the tension inside your soul, as if something within you is both collapsing and awakening. That is why you feel drawn to understand your past, not with bitterness, but with a sense of sacred responsibility. The psyche is preparing you to meet the version of yourself who was never allowed to exist, the authentic self buried beneath years of adaptation, self-abandonment, and emotional vigilance that was once necessary for survival. When you heal the mother wound, you do not simply heal your relationship with your mother, you heal the entire architecture of your emotional world. You heal the unconscious patterns that shape your relationships, your self-perception, your ability to receive, your sense of belonging, your capacity for intimacy, and most of all, you heal the fractured connection between your inner child and your adult self, the connection that determines whether you live from instinct or from truth. The mother is the first symbol of the world. Before you knew language, before you understood time, before you formed a sense of I. She was the environment, the cosmos, the everything. Her gaze shaped your sense of reality. Her reaction to your expression shaped your understanding of danger and safety. Her emotional availability or absence shaped your expectations of connection to the unconscious. She is the primordial ground from which your self emerges. So when that ground is unstable, the psyche becomes fragmented around protecting itself rather than expressing itself. It builds adaptations, masks, compensations. It forms a personality that can function but not thrive. Many people think the mother wound is simply about childhood memories that linger. But the truth is, it is the architecture that built your shadow. The parts of you that were too loud, too sensitive, too emotional, too independent, too intuitive, too bright, too curious. The parts that threatened the emotional equilibrium of the caregiving environment were exiled into the unconscious. Not because the mother was malicious, but because she was overwhelmed, underdeveloped, or carrying her own unhealed pain. So the child learns to amputate aspects of the self to maintain connection. You abandoned yourself in order not to lose the mother. This is the first great paradox of human development. The very parts of you that were most essential to your destiny are often the ones you had to bury to preserve attachment. This is why, when the mother wound begins to surface in adult life, you feel it as both grief and revelation. You grieve the parts of you that went unseen, but you also begin to sense the power of what remains hidden within. You feel the psychic tension of something wanting to return, something ancient, something sacred, something unbroken. The version of you that was never allowed to exist is not weak, it is not wounded, it is not incomplete. It is the original template of your being the instinctual, intuitive, emotionally resonant self that carried your earliest truths before you learned how to betray them. Healing the mother wound is the process of calling that self back, not with force, not with anger, not with blame, but with deep, conscious presence, the presence you never received. But now must learn to give yourself. You must understand that the psyche does not heal through confrontation, it heals through integration. When the mother wound rises, the purpose is not to judge the mother, but to illuminate the unconscious patterns that shaped you. The psyche invites you to step into the role of the inner mother, the one who can offer what the outer mother could not provide, not because she failed, but because she was human, and humans love with the tools they have, even if those tools are incomplete. In the symbolic language of dreams, the mother often appears not as a literal figure, but as a landscape, a house, a room, a presence that holds or withholds warmth, a river that flows or runs dry, a forest that nourishes or confuses. The dream reveals the emotional environment from which you emerged. It reveals how the psyche encoded the early experience of being held or not held. And it shows you that healing is not about rewriting the past, but about awakening the consciousness that transforms its meaning. To heal the mother wound is to re-enter the symbolic house of your childhood and reclaim what you left behind. It is to walk through the inner rooms where you once silenced yourself. It is to find the child who still waits for permission to exist. And when you meet that child not as a frightened memory, but as a living presence inside you, you will begin to realize that the true healing does not come from the outer mother. It comes from recognizing that the lost part of you has been waiting for your return. You are not healing for the sake of the past. You are healing because your future cannot unfold until the self you abandoned is restored. The version of you that was never allowed to exist is not a fantasy. It is the most real part of you. It is the self that carries your intuition, your creativity, your sensitivity, your instinct, your authentic emotional truth. And until you reclaim these aspects, life will feel like a repeating pattern, a cycle that echoes the emotional atmosphere of your early years. No matter how far you travel or how much you accomplish, the psyche repeats what it has not yet understood. It recreates emotional environments that mirror the original wound, not to punish you, but to reveal you. Every relationship that overwhelms, every partner that withdraws, every person who cannot hold your emotional depth, all of these are symbolic reenactments of the original emotional landscape. The psyche brings the pattern back not because you are trapped, but because it wants you to see it. It wants you to awaken inside the dream. Only then can the cycle break. Only then can the version of you that was never allowed to exist finally emerge. When we speak of awakening inside the dream, we are speaking of the moment consciousness turns its gaze inward and sees the architecture of its own suffering. The pain is not the enemy. The pain is the messenger. It carries the encoded story of the child who could not speak, could not express, could not be held in the fullness of their being. But now, as an adult, you possess a capacity that the child did not have the capacity to witness. And witnessing is a sacred act. It is the transformation of unconscious memory into conscious meaning. It is the alchemical fire that turns inherited wounds into individual wisdom. To witness the mother wound is to stand at the threshold between two worlds, the world you learned to survive in and the world you were meant to grow into. And in that space, many people feel a trembling inside their psyche, as if the soul is both terrified and relieved. Terrified because the old adaptations are dissolving, relieved because the true self senses an opportunity to return. People often ask, why does the mother wound feel so overwhelming? And I tell them, because it is the earliest emotional imprint the psyche carries. It is the template through which you learned what love is, what safety is, what belonging is, what intimacy feels like. When that template is fractured, every relationship becomes a mirror of it. Every emotional journey becomes an echo of it. But when the template heals, the entire structure of your emotional life reorganizes itself. The psyche does not heal in fragments, it heals in patterns. When the root is transformed, every branch of your being begins to grow differently. In the symbolic world of the unconscious, the mother archetype is not merely the personal mother. It is the principle of nourishment, containment, emotional attunement, and psychic holding. It is the womb from which your inner life emerges. So when that archetype is distorted through neglect, emotional volatility, enmeshment, or even excessive control, the psyche learns to protect itself from the very source it longs for. And so you grow with a strange contradiction inside, a profound hunger for connection and a simultaneous fear of dependence, a longing to be understood, and a deep belief that your truth is too much, an instinct to soften, and a compulsion to armor yourself. This internal contradiction is not a flaw. It is the wounded child negotiating a world that felt unstable. You learned to modulate your emotions to avoid backlash. You learned to hide your needs to avoid disappointment. You learned to anticipate danger in silence, in tone, in subtle changes of expression. These adaptations were not mistakes, they were necessary for survival. But now, as an adult, these same adaptations restrict your ability to live fully. They keep you in cycles that drain your energy, relationships that mirror your early wounds, and emotional strategies that no longer serve your growth. This is why healing the mother wound is not simply an emotional task, it is a psychic initiation. It is the point where the ego must surrender to the deeper wisdom of the unconscious. You must allow the shadow to reveal the parts of you that were exiled, ignored, or misunderstood, and the shadow does not reveal itself through logic, it reveals itself through dreams, symbols, emotional triggers, and moments where your reaction seems larger than the situation. These eruptions are not evidence of brokenness, they are evidence that something inner is ready to return. Consider the dream of a woman who repeatedly found herself wandering through a childhood home, opening doors that led to unfamiliar rooms. Each room carried a strange mixture of memory and imagination, familiar furniture placed in impossible configurations, corridors that led to nowhere, voices in distant corners, calling her by a name she no longer used. This dream, she told me, brought her both fear and longing. And I explained to her, this is the psyche inviting you to re-enter the inner house, to open the rooms where emotions were once stored and forgotten. The unfamiliar rooms represent the parts of you that were never allowed to form. They are the corridors of the self that were left incomplete because the emotional environment did not support their development. When the dream finally brought her to a locked door, she felt paralyzed. She knew intuitively that what lay behind that door was the heart of her wound. And when she finally gathered the courage to open it, she found a small version of herself sitting in silence, waiting, unmoving, untouched by time. This inner child was not weeping, not angry, not pleading, simply waiting. That is the truth of the self. You abandoned it, never disappears. It waits until you are strong enough to return. Healing does not happen when you force yourself to change. Healing happens when you allow yourself to remember. The psyche heals through reconnection, not correction. And the child within you needs one thing above all, the presence that was absent, the presence that says, I see you, I hear you, you belong, you are allowed to exist. Many people misunderstand inner child work as sentimental regression, but it is not regression, it is restoration. It is the adult self becoming the inner parent the child never had. It is the emergence of the inner mother, the one who can offer emotional attunement without fear, acceptance without conditions, boundaries without withdrawal, love without instability. When the inner mother awakens, the mother wound begins to dissolve, not through blame, but through integration. You become the one who offers what your lineage could not, and in doing so, you do not break the ancestral chain, you complete it. Healing the mother wound also requires confronting the illusions you built around strength. Many of you equate strength with self-reliance, emotional suppression, independence to the point of isolation. These are not signs of strength, they are signs of adaptation. The true self is neither hyper-independent nor dependent, it is interdependent. It knows how to be alone without being lonely, and how to connect without losing itself. But the wound itself confuses boundaries with abandonment, closeness with danger, intimacy with obligation. These confusions dissolve only when you return to the original imprint, the early emotional lessons that taught you what love costs. The truth is, love should not cost you yourself, but for many of you, it did. And so you carry an internal expectation that being chosen requires being small, that being safe requires being silent, that being accepted requires being perfect. These beliefs are not conscious, but they shape every interaction, every relationship, every moment where your truth wants to emerge. Healing the mother wound unlocks the version of you who no longer negotiates their worth. It reveals the self who trusts their instincts, expresses their emotions without fear, and stands tall in their truth without apologizing. This self does not need the world to validate them, because their worth is no longer tethered to how others respond. The mother wound ties your identity to external reflection. Healing ties your identity to inner truth. You must understand that the psyche is always attempting to heal itself. Every emotional trigger is a doorway. Every relationship that collapses is a mirror. Every longing that aches inside you is a message from the unconscious. The psyche whispers through desire, through fear, through dreams, through synchronicities. And the mother wound, perhaps more than any other wound, uses these channels to call you inward, not to punish you, but to bring you home. To heal is to reclaim your original belonging, the belonging that does not depend on others, but on your relationship with your own soul. The version of you that was never allowed to exist still lives within the unconscious, waiting, patient, untouched by the noise of the world. You do not become that version through achievement, discipline, or external change. You become that version the moment you stop abandoning yourself. And when you finally meet that self, when you feel it rise within you like a forgotten memory awakening, you will understand what I have been trying to tell you. The mother wound was not the end of your story. It was the doorway into the beginning of your true one. There comes a moment, often unexpected, when the psyche begins to pull back the veils that once protected you. These veils were necessary in childhood, for the truth was too overwhelming for a young mind to carry. But as consciousness matures, the same veils become obstacles. They blur your vision, distort your relationships, and keep you walking in patterns that no longer reflect who you are becoming. Healing the mother wound requires the courage to let these veils fall, one by one, not all at once, but in rhythms that match your readiness. This unfolding is not linear. It is circular, wave-like, revealing, retreating, revealing again. Often, people experience this process as a sudden emotional awakening, a collapse of old defenses, or even what feels like a crisis. But what appears as breakdown is usually breakthrough. The psyche is refusing to let you live from the adaptations that no longer sustain you. It is demanding that you confront the origins of your suffering, not through intellectual analysis alone, but through embodied truth. The body remembers what the mind learned to forget. The tightening in your chest, the heaviness in your stomach, the contraction before vulnerability. These somatic echoes are remnants of early emotional landscapes. They are reminders of the moments where your needs were too large for the environment, where your presence felt like an inconvenience, where your emotions had no place to land. To heal, you must allow the body to speak. The body is the archive of the unconscious. It holds the emotional stories the mind abandoned, and when the mother wound begins to surface, the body trembles with memories that were never metabolized. But this trembling is not danger. It is release. It is the thawing of emotions that were frozen in time. Just as snow melts in spring, the psyche melts old pain to allow new life to emerge. Many people resist this stage because it feels destabilizing. You begin to question your identity, your patterns, your beliefs, your sense of worth. You feel waves of sadness that seem disproportionate to your current life, or anger that feels ancient, or longing that has no clear source. But these waves are not random. They are the return of the exiled self. They rise with intensity because they are reclaiming space within your consciousness. When the child inside you rises, they do not come with logic. They come with raw truth. The truth that says, I needed to be held. The truth that says, I was afraid. The truth that says, I was told to be strong before I was ready. The truth that says, I hid myself so you wouldn't abandon me. The child speaks the language of the soul, emotional, symbolic, non-linear. And to ignore this voice is to ignore your own becoming. But something remarkable happens when you finally listen. The child softens, the body relaxes, the shadow begins to open, and you begin to feel, perhaps for the first time, the presence of your deeper self. This is the self that was never allowed to exist because it did not fit the emotional script of your early environment. But it is also the self that carries your intuition, your vitality, your creativity, your spiritual sensitivity. It is the self that was born whole before life demanded you fragment. As this self rises, it often brings with it dreams that are profoundly symbolic. You may dream of water-deep rivers, dark oceans, flooded rooms, rain that falls without end. Water is the symbol of the unconscious, of emotional depth, of the mother archetype in its primal form. When the waters rise in your dreams, it means the unconscious is reclaiming its place, demanding that you acknowledge what has long been hidden. You may dream of drowning, but understand, this drowning in dreams does not signify death, it signifies surrender. The ego is loosening its grip, allowing the deeper currents of the psyche to guide the healing process. You may also dream of animals, injured birds, lost wolves, silent deer. These creatures represent instinctual parts of you that were wounded by early emotional environments. Birds may symbolize your ability to speak, to express, to fly. Wolves may symbolize your instinct, your power, your connection to the wild within. Deer may symbolize vulnerability, gentleness, intuition. When these animals appear wounded, it means your instincts were impaired by the mother wound. But when they heal in your dreams, it indicates that your true nature is strengthening. The unconscious does not heal with words, it heals with symbols. And as these symbols move through you, you begin to sense that the mother wound is more than a psychological concept, it is a spiritual doorway. It invites you to step into the lineage of your own becoming, to rewrite the emotional inheritance you received, to awaken the archetypal mother within you. This inner mother is not limited by the wounds of your biological line. She is transcendent, intuitive, fierce, nurturing, whole, and when she awakens, something extraordinary happens. The child inside you stops seeking permission to exist. You must understand that this is the moment when the true transformation begins. The child no longer waits for someone to choose them. The adult self no longer fears abandonment. The emotional patterns that once dominated your relationships begin to dissolve. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop interpreting emotional distance as your fault. You stop bending yourself to survive in spaces that cannot hold you. This is the version of you that was never allowed to exist, the version that does not apologize for their truth, that does not shrink to be loved, that does not trade authenticity for attachment. And this version is not born through rebellion, but through integration. It is the natural self that emerges when you stop betraying your emotional reality. But before this self can fully emerge, the psyche must lead you through one more initiation, the confrontation with the internalized mother. This is a feeling of hearing her voice inside your mind, the voice that says, "Be careful, Don't be too much. Don't upset anyone. You are responsible for others' feelings. These are not your beliefs. They are inherited scripts. They are echoes of the emotional climate you grew up in. And to heal, you must recognize that these voices are not the voice of truth. They are the voices of survival. As you begin to differentiate from the internalized mother, you realize something liberating. You can love your mother and still heal from her. Healing does not require blame. It requires clarity. You do not need to turn her into a villain. You need to understand her as a human being, shaped by her own lineage of wounds. Compassion does not erase truth. It illuminates it, and when you see her humanity clearly, you no longer confuse her limitations with your worth. This clarity is what allows the psyche to reorganize. The foundation of your emotional world shifts from fear to presence, from vigilance to trust, from self-abandonment to self-attunement. You begin to feel deeply, quietly, steadily that you belong to yourself, and belonging to yourself is the essence of healing, because once you belong to yourself, you no longer seek permission to be who you are. You no longer shrink around people who cannot meet your depth. You no longer fear being misunderstood. You no longer enter relationships hoping to be saved. You begin to live from the truth that was buried beneath the wound, the truth that you were always enough, always whole, always worthy of being seen. And as this truth rises, the version of you that was never allowed to exist begins to breathe. They step forward. They reach for life. They speak with clarity. They feel without fear. They love without losing themselves. They walk into the world with a presence that is calm, grounded, quietly powerful, the presence that emerges when the soul is no longer divided against itself. This is the rebirth the mother wound prepares you for. Not the rebirth of becoming someone new, but the rebirth of returning to who you were always meant to be. There is a profound stillness that arrives near the end of this journey, a stillness not born from avoidance or numbness, but from the deep internal realignment that occurs when the psyche is finally permitted to inhabit its own space. This stillness is different from silence. Silence can be tense, defensive, filled with the echoes of unspoken fear, but stillness is spacious. Stillness is alive. Stillness is the state of a psyche no longer hiding from itself. And it is within this stillness that the version of you once exiled begins to integrate into your waking life. You may notice, perhaps subtly at first, that your reactions shift. What once triggered you now brings curiosity. What once overwhelmed you now feels manageable. What once sent you into spirals of self-doubt now invites deeper inquiry. This is because the child who was once unprotected is now accompanied by the adult self who has become conscious. You have become, in a symbolic sense, the inner mother, the one who offers stability, attunement, clarity, and emotional presence. But understand this healing, the mother wound, does not mean you erase the past, nor does it mean you rewrite it into something comforting. True healing does not distort memory. It integrates it. You hold the truth of what happened without letting that truth define your destiny. You understand that your mother, too, was shaped by her own unconscious inheritance, shaped by the emotional absence she endured, the expectations imposed upon her, the unspoken grief she carried, the limitations she never learned to transcend. When you see her clearly, without the projections of the wounded child or the defenses of the guarded adult, a quiet compassion arises, not a compassion that negates your pain, but one that frees you from carrying the burden of her unresolved life. The moment you stop trying to fix your mother, internally or externally, the wound begins to release its hold. Because the wound was never about changing her, it was about reclaiming you. And only when you release the responsibility of carrying what was never yours to carry, does the psyche find the space to expand. This expansion often feels like returning to a landscape you have not seen in years, a place within you that holds wonder, creativity, intuition, and vitality. You may feel impulses to create, to express, to speak truths long buried. You may find yourself drawn to activities that once brought you joy as a child: drawing, writing, dancing, wandering through nature, contemplating symbols, following curiosity without purpose. This is not regression, it is resurrection. The resurrected self brings with it the innocence of the unbroken child, not naive, but pure in its capacity to feel life directly. But with this resurrection comes another challenge. You must allow this self to live in the world. Many people unlock their authentic self internally, but are afraid to express that self externally. They fear the reactions of others, fear destabilizing relationships, fear stepping into a life that no longer fits the expectations of their environment. But understand this healing, the mother wound, does not only change your inner world, it inevitably transforms your outer one. Some relationships will deepen because they were built on authenticity. Others will dissolve because they were constructed upon your self-abandonment. Do not fear this. The version of you that was never allowed to exist cannot flourish in the soil of old patterns. She or he requires new ground, new relational dynamics, new emotional nourishment. You are not betraying anyone by becoming yourself. You are simply ceasing to betray your own soul. There comes a particular moment, often quiet and unceremonious, when you realize that you are no longer motivated by the old patterns, the need to please, to be chosen, to be approved of, to be invisible, to be indispensable. These patterns fall away not through force, but through irrelevance. When the inner self becomes whole, external validation loses its power. You do not need the world to confirm your worth when you no longer question it. This is the moment when the soul steps out of hiding. And when it does, you begin to feel an extraordinary shift in your perception. You no longer see yourself through the lens of the child who was shaped by scarcity and fear. You begin to see yourself through the lens of the self who has survived, awakened, integrated, and risen. This self understands that boundaries are not weapons but expressions of truth. That vulnerability is not weakness but transparency. That independence is not armor but freedom. You must allow this version of you to take its rightful place in your life. Do not treat it as a fragile visitor. Do not let it remain in the shadow. Invite it into your choices, your relationships, your creative expression, your presence in the world. This is the version of you that was once forbidden because its existence threatened the emotional equilibrium of your early environment. But now you are free, and in that freedom, the psyche restores what was suppressed. It is often at this stage that you begin to feel a deep sense of grief, not the grief of the wound itself, but the grief for the years you spent away from yourself. Let this grief come. It is not sorrow, it is tribute. Tribute to the child who survived without guidance. Tribute to the adult who carried burdens not meant for them. Tribute to the self who waited quietly in the shadows, trusting that one day you would return. This grief is the closing of an old chapter, the final release of the identity shaped by adaptation. On the other side of this grief comes an inner spaciousness that feels almost sacred. You begin to realize that healing the mother wound was never simply about emotional repair, it was about spiritual emergence. It was about calling back the pieces of your soul scattered across years of self-denial. It was about stepping into a destiny that could only unfold once you reclaimed your inner wholeness. And if you listen carefully, you may feel something else rise within you, strength, not the brittle strength of survival, but the grounded strength of integration. This strength is not loud. It does not need to prove itself. It radiates quietly, like a deep-rooted tree standing through seasons without fear of the wind. This strength is the natural result of belonging to yourself, because when you belong to yourself, no one can take your inner home from you. Now the question becomes, what happens when the version of you that was never allowed to exist finally stands in the light of your consciousness? The answer is simple and profound. Life begins. Not the life constructed from shoulds, expectations, inherited fears, or unconscious roles, but the life aligned with your true nature. This life does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires authenticity. It requires the willingness to act not from survival, but from truth. You begin to make choices that reflect your inner alignment. You say no where you once felt obligated. You say yes where you once felt afraid. You create boundaries not to push people away, but to protect your inner equilibrium. You connect with others from a place of clarity rather than longing. You pursue experiences that nourish your soul rather than fulfill external expectations. This is what it means to exist as the self once forbidden. You live with integrity, not performance. You love with depth, not desperation. You speak with truth, not apology. You walk with presence, not pretense. And as you do, the world responds differently, because the world mirrors your inner state. When you embody your true self, you attract relationships, opportunities, and paths that match your authenticity. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this entire journey is this: when you heal the mother wound, you become the person who can love without repeating it. You become the generation breaker. You become the conscious parent, whether literally or symbolically, who offers presence instead of projection, attunement instead of neglect, boundaries instead of enmeshment, acceptance instead of fear. You interrupt the lineage of unconscious suffering. You become the place where the wound ends and wisdom begins. This is the legacy of your healing. This is the purpose hidden within your pain. This is the reason the wound surfaced with such intensity, because the version of you capable of transforming it had finally awakened. So now, as I close this lecture, I want you to feel something not as an idea, but as a truth resonating in your chest. The self you are becoming is not an accident. The healing you are undergoing is not a burden. The pain you carried was not punishment. It was initiation. Initiation into the deepest truth of your being, that you were always meant to return to yourself. And now that you have begun this return, the version of you that was never allowed to exist finally rises, breathes, and walks into the world with the quiet, undeniable power of a soul reclaimed